You're listening to ThoughtCast. I'm Jenny Attiyeh, and I'm in the office of Helen Vendler, the distinguished poetry critic and A. Kingsley Porter University professor at Harvard. Helen, you've just published a new book on Emily Dickinson, which contains 150 of her poems, accompanied by your commentary. And when I asked you to choose a poem to discuss that you think is important and meaningful, you chose the poem titled, "I Cannot Live With You." Would you read the first few stanzas?
Okay. I cannot live with you. It would be life. And life is over there, behind the shelf the sexton keeps the key to, putting up our life, his porcelain, like a cup discarded of the housewife, quaint or broke. A newer Sèvres pleases, old ones crack. I could not die with you, for one must wait to shut the other's gaze down. You could not. And could I stand by and see you freeze without my right of frost, death's privilege? Nor could I rise with you, because your face would put out Jesus. That new grace glow plain and foreign on my homesick eye, except that you, than he, shone closer by.
Emily Dickinson, one of the facts that's most used and abused about her is that she sought out a solitary life. This is a poem about a particular individual, but do you think it reflects her preference for living apart?
No one knows. She never said that she chose a solitary life as such. On the contrary, she has many poems of disappointed love and despair at isolation. So I wouldn't say she chose it, but Adrienne Rich suggested, if I remember correctly, that she may have seen it happening to her and not objected or not done anything to counteract it. More recently, Lyndall Gordon has suggested that the illness to which Dickinson frequently refers might be epilepsy, which might account for her losing consciousness in some poems, feeling a cleaving in her brain in others. That can't be definitely proved either, but it might explain why she did not want to be out in public if she was subject to petit or grand mal. We won't know. She was lucky, I think, as Adrienne Rich also said, in that by staying in the house, she was exempt from all the usual duties of single women, sitting by the bedsides of the dying, taking care of the children of others, doing general good works in the community, though no one could get at her, you might say, while she remained in her father's house. And they gave her the privacy she needed. It was known that she wrote poems, and occasionally even she read them to her brother and sister-in-law, as she played the piano, too, in their house across the lawn.
I don't want to make the mistake of assuming that the I in this poem is Emily. However, I sense that she turned inward for her inspiration. She certainly wasn't roving around town. So with this in mind, she's saying, I cannot live with you. But perhaps she's saying, I cannot, when really she will not live with you?
It would be possible to see at least the first line in that way, but since she ascribes agency to someone else, that the sexton, who is a stand-in for God, the religious keeper of the church, has put the possibility of their joint life aside, the way a housewife would discard some piece of china, strikes me that she's not taking responsibility for the state of affairs herself, and she is ascribing it to God.
Yes, and that powerlessness surprises me in this poem, but perhaps, again, I don't want to read in too much and assume the I is Emily Dickinson.
I never mind assuming the lyric poet is the person who wrote. There's always an adjustment to the life situation because it's being turned into a work of art, just as a portrait painter might adjust. Think of what Picasso did to the portraits of his wives. The faces are very much adjusted, to say the least, but still he was using his wife as a model. Here, it seems to me, she gives certain specificities. You served heaven, you know, or sought to. I could not. That puts the religious difference between them squarely as the cause of their separation. And I'm perfectly willing to believe that that's the case.
Let's finish the rest of the poem.
All right, we go into another set of alternatives. After I can't live with you, I couldn't die with you, and I couldn't rise with you. She imagines themselves in heaven, and she would rather have his face than Jesus' face. Unless his face was there to put out Jesus, she wouldn't be happy. Then she envisages them facing the last judgment. They'd judge us. How? For you served heaven, you know, or sought to. I could not, because you saturated sight, and I had no more eyes for sordid excellence as paradise. And were you lost, I would be, though my name rang loudest on the heavenly fame. And were you saved, and I condemned to be where you were not, that self were hell to me. So we must meet apart, you there, I here, with just the door ajar that oceans are, and prayer, and that white sustenance, despair.
You write in your commentary this is a poem of torture.
Mm.
She chooses, or is forced to choose, despair, and he relies upon prayer.
Yes.
But she doesn't reject him for this difference. She accepts it.
Yes. She would be glad to overlook the fact that he served heaven, but he can't overlook the fact that she could not bring herself to be a religious person. So that, yes, she doesn't criticize him for praying at all.
He also happened to be married.
That's true, that's true. But poems are, of course, enacted in wish fulfillment more than anything else.
Last question, Helen Vendler. Now that you're no longer a girl of 13, but an esteemed Harvard poetry professor and critic, how has your sense of this poem changed?
Well, like any other young reader, I was reading for truth. What were the real truths of life? And I hadn't found them except in poetry, hadn't found them expressed in ways I could take in. So when I first was reading poems such as this, they were scanning for me a dimension of emotional experience, and I wasn't thinking about them as poems particularly. I was thinking about them as descriptions of life. And only later, when I began to wonder how these wonderful effects were achieved, would I think, oh, what is she doing here? And then I would see the word that comes out from the page, either in letters of gold or in letters of black, in this case, something that is not expected, and begin to wonder why the choices of the poets went as they did, and why, for instance, she confined herself by and large to these brief poems and rather standard rhyme schemes. She did extraordinary things with them, but a lot of poets have wanted more elbow room than she wants. So you begin to think, why is this poet doing things this way? Why did Shakespeare want to write 154 sonnets? Why did he want to have 4 protagonists instead of the classic 2? The choices are always there when you read them as an adult.
Is it also that your knowledge and your attention to these poems has provided you a sense of distance, critical distance, that you wouldn't have had at 13?
I certainly didn't have critical distance at 13, that's true. But there's a way in which you can always go back into a poem to re-experience it as you first saw it when you were surprised by everything that was happening from development to development. And that sense of how surprising each turn of this poem is what would strike anybody reading the poem for the first time, how trapped she is, how much she's looking for this alternative, that alternative. Could I live with him? Could I die with him? Could I go to heaven with him? So I think you can go back down into a first response to it, I think always. It would be too bad if you couldn't.
Helen Vendler, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you for asking questions.
You've been listening to ThoughtCast. I'm Jenny Attiyeh. Thanks for joining us.